Do you believe that compassion can exist even in the wildest heart of nature? What if I told you a bear saved a life in the most unbelievable way? Every year, over 20,000 cases of child abandonment are reported worldwide. But this story is different. It begins with a cruel father, a deserted road, and a baby left to fend for itself. What happens next? It's something no one could have predicted. Stick around until the end of this video to uncover the astonishing act that changed everything, and see how the ending of this shocking story is touching hearts around the globe. Get ready, because what you're about to see will challenge everything you thought you knew about the wild side of life. The pickup truck roared along the empty Montana highway, its engine sputtering with age and abuse. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid scent of stale whiskey and cigarette smoke, mixing with the faint tang of rust from the battered truck bed. Davi sat in the passenger seat, his wiry frame hunched against the door as he stared out at the endless expanse of dark desert. The boy's brown eyes, usually restless and curious, were now hollow, fixed on the stars above as if searching for something to hold on to. The driver, Jake, gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw set in a rigid scowl. His unkempt beard and bloodshot eyes made him look older than his 40-some years, a man worn down by years of hardship and self-destruction. Jake had been drinking since noon, the whiskey bottle nestled between his thighs as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. The silence between them was sharp and brittle, broken only by the hum of the truck's tires on the cracked asphalt. The tension had been building for days, weeks, even. But tonight, it reached a breaking point. "You don't even care, do you?" Jake slurred suddenly, his voice harsh and jagged. His words cut through the stillness like a blade. "You think you can just sit there, doing nothing, while I work my ass off for you?" Davi didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that silence was safer than talking when his father was like this. Any response, no matter how careful, could ignite Jake's temper further. Instead, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape blur past. Jake wasn't done. "You're just like your mother," he spat, the venom in his words making Davi flinch. "Always looking down at me, always thinking you're too good for me." The mention of his mother was like a slap. Davi clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he said nothing. His mother's death 3 years ago had fractured their already fragile family. Since then, Jake had spiraled deeper into anger and addiction, and Davi had become the target of his father's frustrations. The truck swerved suddenly, veering too close to the shoulder, and Davi's heart skipped a beat. Jake corrected with a jerk of the wheel, muttering curses under his breath. The bottle of whiskey sloshed, nearly tipping over, and Jake grabbed it with one hand, taking a long swig. "You think you're so smart, huh?" Jake said, his voice rising. "Sitting there, acting like you're better than me. You're nothing, Davi. Nothing." Davi felt the words like punches, each one hitting harder than the last. He wanted to yell back, to defend himself, but his throat felt tight, his voice locked away. Instead, he turned his face further toward the window, willing himself not to cry. He wouldn't give Jake the satisfaction. The argument escalated. Jake's insults grew louder, more cutting, and Davi could feel the heat of his father's rage filling the cab like a suffocating fog. The boy's chest tightened as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Then it happened. The truck skidded to a sudden halt on the gravel shoulder, throwing Davi forward against his seatbelt. Jake slammed the gear into park and turned toward him, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Get out," Jake snarled. Davi blinked, confused. "What?" "I said get out," Jake shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "You want to act like you don't need me? Fine. Let's see how you do on your own." For a moment, Davi thought it was just another empty threat, one of the many cruel things Jake said when he was drunk. But then Jake reached across him, yanking the door open with a screech of rusted hinges. Before Davi could react, his father's hands were on him, rough and unyielding. The shove came fast and hard. Davi tumbled out of the truck, hitting the ground with a jarring thud. His palms scraped against the gravel, the sharp sting making him gasp. He barely had time to scramble to his knees before the door slammed shut and the truck roared back to life. "Dad!" Davi yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Wait, but the truck was already pulling away. Its taillights glowed like twin embers in the darkness, shrinking as the vehicle sped down the empty highway. Davi stumbled to his feet, his heart racing, his voice rising to a desperate shout. Dad, come back. Don't leave me. The words echoed uselessly into the night. The truck didn't slow, didn't turn around. It disappeared over the horizon, leaving Davi alone on the side of the road. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that seemed to swallow every sound. For a long moment, Davi stood there, frozen. The desert air was cold against his skin, the stars overhead glittering like shards of broken glass. His mind reeled, unable to fully process what had just happened. His father, the only family he had left, had abandoned him, thrown him away like garbage. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, and he sank to his knees, his scraped hands trembling. Tears blurred his vision, but he wiped them away angrily. Crying wouldn't help him now. Davi took a shaky breath and forced himself to think. He looked around, his surroundings barely illuminated by the pale light of the crescent moon. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and desolate. On one side, the open desert sprawled out into the night, its jagged rocks and sparse vegetation cast in eerie shadows. On the other, the dense outline of a forest loomed, its edges dark and impenetrable. The forest frightened him. It was unknown, unpredictable, but the road felt even worse. Out here, he was exposed, vulnerable. If no cars came, he could die of thirst or exposure before anyone found him. The forest, at least, offered a chance of shelter. Davi stood shakily, brushing dirt off his torn jeans. His knees and palms throbbed, the cuts stinging with each movement, but he ignored the pain. He had no choice but to move. With one last glance at the empty highway, Davi turned and began walking toward the forest. His steps were slow and hesitant at first, but as the cold bit deeper into his skin, urgency pushed him forward. Behind him, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to his plight. Ahead, the shadows of the trees swallowed him whole. Davi watched the truck's red taillights fade into the distance, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The world around him was a void of darkness and cold. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. His father wasn't coming back. He was alone. The quiet of the Montana wilderness was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The vastness of the landscape seemed to press down on Davi, making him feel smaller than ever. He rubbed his scraped palms, the sting sharp and raw, as he scanned his surroundings for any sign of direction. On one side of the road, an endless stretch of desert plains extended toward a horizon bathed in the faint glow of starlight. On the other, a dense forest loomed, its shadows shifting under the pale light of the moon. The forest seemed both threatening and inviting, a choice between danger and desolation. The road felt hopelessly empty, offering no promise of passing cars or rescue. Davi swallowed hard and turned toward the trees. If he was going to survive, he needed shelter, and the forest was his best chance. The first steps into the wilderness were cautious. The thick carpet of pine needles muffled his footsteps, but every crack of a branch beneath his sneakers made his heart jump. He moved carefully, hands stretched in front of him to avoid unseen obstacles. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and wood. His jacket, thin and insufficient, offered little protection against the biting wind that cut through the trees. As Davi ventured deeper, the darkness became almost impenetrable. Moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy above, casting shifting shadows on the forest floor. Every sound felt magnified. The distant chirping of crickets, the occasional snap of a twig, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. His imagination ran wild, conjuring images of predators stalking him from the shadows. Wolves, coyotes, mountain lions. He forced himself to focus on his steps, but the fear gnawed at him. After what felt like hours, the fatigue began to set in. Davi's legs ached, his scraped knees throbbed, and his stomach growled loudly in the stillness. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial movements was fading, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He stumbled over a root, catching himself just in time to avoid falling face first into the dirt. The scrape reopened, and he hissed in pain, clutching his bleeding palms. "Come on, Davi," he muttered to himself. "You can do this." Talking aloud gave him a sliver of comfort, a way to push back against the crushing silence. He stumbled upon a large fallen log and sank down onto it, his chest heaving. He looked around at the unfamiliar world, illuminated faintly by the dim moonlight. The forest seemed alive in a way that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He felt like an intruder in a place governed by rules he didn't understand. The cold deepened as the night wore on, seeping into his bones. Shivering, Davi hugged his knees to his chest, trying to conserve body heat. He knew he couldn't sit still for long. If he didn't keep moving, the cold would overtake him. But exhaustion tugged at him, and his eyelids grew heavy. He leaned against the log, trying to stay awake, but sleep eventually claimed him. It wasn't a restful sleep. Davi's dreams were a tangled mess of images. His mother's face, warm and smiling, dissolving into his father's angry scowl. The truck's headlights fading into the night, and a pair of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness. He jolted awake, his heart pounding, unsure if the eyes were real or imagined. The forest around him was eerily quiet, the usual night sounds conspicuously absent. Davi scanned the darkness, his breath visible in the frigid air. Something felt wrong. He stood, his legs shaky, and resumed walking, hoping to put distance between himself and whatever might be lurking. As dawn began to break, the forest transformed. The once imposing shadows softened as light filtered through the trees, revealing vibrant greens and browns. Davi's spirits lifted slightly at the sight of the sun rising over the horizon. The warmth of the light gave him a small surge of hope, though his situation remained dire. The morning air carried a faint sound, like the murmur of running water. Davi's ears perked up, and he turned toward the sound, his thirst suddenly overwhelming. He pushed through the underbrush, his pace quickening despite the fatigue weighing on his limbs. After a short distance, he stumbled upon a stream, its clear water flowing over smooth rocks. Dropping to his knees, Davi cupped his hands and drank deeply, the cold water soothing his parched throat. The taste was pure and refreshing, a rare comfort in an otherwise terrifying night. He splashed his face, the shock of the cold water waking him fully. He let himself breathe, letting the sound of the stream calm his nerves. But as he knelt there, he became aware of something else, a presence. He froze, his hands still in the water, as a shadow moved across the opposite bank of the stream. His heart pounded in his chest as he lifted his head. A massive bear stood just a few feet away. The water trickled through the rocks, its sound deceptively serene against the chaos pounding in Davi's chest. He froze, his hands still dripping, as the massive bear stared at him from across the stream. Its fur was a deep, glossy brown, darker around its face and shoulders, and its sheer size was overwhelming. Every detail of the animal was sharply etched in Davi's mind. The way its ears twitched slightly at the sound of the water, the powerful muscles shifting beneath its coat, and, most unnerving of all, the deep, intelligent gleam in its black eyes. For a few heart-stopping moments, neither of them moved. Davi's breath caught in his throat, and he realized he'd been holding it far too long. He forced himself to exhale slowly, quietly, hoping not to startle the animal. He had heard enough stories to know what a bear could do, stories of hikers who hadn't lived to tell their tales. "Don't run," he thought. His instinct screamed at him to flee, but he knew that turning his back and bolting would only provoke the animal. Running would make him prey. The bear took a step forward. The ground seemed to quake beneath its massive paw, and Davi flinched, pressing himself back against a large rock by the stream's edge. His fingers dug into the dirt as he tried to stay calm. The bear lowered its nose to the ground, sniffing the air. It tilted its head slightly, its movements deliberate and curious rather than aggressive. Davi's mind raced. Why isn't it charging? He wondered. He remembered the countless documentaries he'd watched with his mom before she passed away. She had loved nature shows, and though Davi had only half paid attention most of the time, A fragment of advice surfaced in his mind now. Make yourself look bigger. Don't panic. He slowly rose to his feet, keeping his movements measured. He spread his arms wide, hoping to appear larger. Hey there, he said softly, his voice trembling. I'm not gonna hurt you. Just stay over there, okay? The bear's gaze remained fixed on him, but its posture didn't scream aggression. Its ears weren't flattened, its fur wasn't bristling, and its body language lacked the tension he'd expect from a predator about to strike. Instead, the bear seemed curious. It stepped closer, wading into the stream. The water splashed around its legs, the sound loud and rhythmic. Davi's heart pounded as the bear stopped on the other side of the stream, just a few feet away. Up close, it was even more enormous. Its head easily level with Davi's chest, its claws long and sharp, glinting faintly in the morning light. He could feel the warmth of its breath on his skin. Davi clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream or run. His legs felt like jelly, but he stood his ground, meeting the bear's gaze. Its dark eyes, so alien yet so strikingly alive, seemed to search him, as though trying to understand him. For a fleeting moment, Davi wondered if it was sizing him up as food. The thought made his stomach twist. The bear sniffed the air again, then lowered its head to the water. It drank deeply, its massive shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Davi watched in awe, the tension in his body slowly giving way to a strange sense of calm. He took a cautious step back, testing to see if the bear would react. It didn't. Another step, then another, until Davi was back on the shore, his sneakers pressing into the soft mud. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, just stay there." But the bear finished drinking and turned its attention back to him. It climbed out of the stream, its movements graceful despite its bulk, and took a few deliberate steps forward. Davi's heart leapt into his throat. Why is it coming closer? He thought. His brain screamed at him to think, to act, to do something. But what? Then the bear did something unexpected. It stopped and sat down. Its sheer size was almost comical in this posture, like an oversized dog. Its front paws rested on the ground, and its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it were studying him. The tension in Davi's body dissolved into confusion. The bear wasn't acting like any predator he had ever heard about. If anything, it seemed curious, gentle. "What are you doing?" Davi asked aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why aren't you attacking me?" The bear blinked at him, its expression unreadable. Davi's legs finally gave out, and he sank onto the ground, his hands trembling. He couldn't take his eyes off the animal, afraid that any lapse in attention might provoke it, but the bear remained still, its dark eyes calm and steady. As the minutes ticked by, Davi began to wonder if he had misjudged the situation entirely. The bear didn't seem to want to hurt him. If it had, it would have already. Instead, it was staying, watching, waiting. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Why is it staying? He thought about his father, the fight in the truck, and the moment he was thrown out onto the road. The anger and confusion that had consumed him were now replaced by a different kind of bewilderment. How could he have gone from that moment of betrayal to this strange, surreal encounter in the wilderness? The bear eventually lay down, stretching out its massive body across the forest floor. It rested its head on its paws, its eyes half closing as if content to simply exist in Davi's presence. The sight was so absurdly peaceful that Davi almost laughed. "Almost. I guess you're not gonna eat me," he murmured. The bear's ears twitched but otherwise didn't react. Davi's fear didn't vanish completely, but it softened into something more manageable. He didn't know what had brought him to this moment, or why this animal had decided not to harm him. All he knew was that, for the first time since his father had abandoned him, he didn't feel entirely alone. The sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the forest in warm light. Davi leaned back against the nearest tree, his body aching but his mind strangely calm. The bear remained close, its presence both unnerving and oddly reassuring. He closed his eyes for just a moment, the sound of the stream lulling him into a fragile sense of safety. When he opened them again, the bear was still there. Davi's fear didn't dissipate, but it was joined by a strange sense of wonder. He didn't move as the bear approached, its massive paws crunching softly against the forest floor. It stopped a few feet away, close enough for Davy to feel its warm breath. The boy held his ground, unsure of what to do. His trembling hand reached out instinctively, not fully aware of his actions. To his astonishment, the bear didn't retreat. It sniffed his hand, its wet nose brushing against his skin. The touch was startlingly gentle. Davy slowly lowered his hand. The bear sat down, its massive frame settling onto the ground like a giant guardian. For reasons he couldn't explain, Davy felt a flicker of hope. The bear wasn't a threat. It was something else. A protector? An ally? He didn't know, but he felt safer with it there. Would you like me to continue the story? If so, I'll expand on Davy's journey, the growing bond with the bear, and the dangers they will face together. The twists and deeper revelations will come as the story unfolds. Morning broke fully, casting the forest in shades of green and gold. Davy rubbed his sore arms, his stomach growling audibly. Hunger gnawed at his insides, and his mouth was parched, his lips cracked. The bear still sat nearby, its gaze sweeping the forest around them like a sentinel. "I need water," Davy whispered, more to himself than to the bear. To his surprise, the animal stood and began lumbering away. For a moment, Davy panicked. Was it leaving him? The thought of being alone again filled him with dread. But then it paused, looking back at him, as though urging him to follow. Davy hesitated, then stumbled after it. The bear moved deliberately, its step steady and confident. It led him deeper into the forest, where the air grew cooler and the trees thicker. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of running water reached Davy's ears. His heart leapt. A crystal-clear stream flowed between mossy rocks, its surface sparkling in the sunlight. Davy fell to his knees at the water's edge, cupping his hands to drink deeply. The cold liquid was a balm to his dry throat, and he drank until his stomach ached. He looked up at the bear, which was watching him silently. "Thanks," he said, feeling foolish but sincere. The bear blinked, then moved to the water to drink as well. Davy marveled at its sheer size, the way it seemed both powerful and peaceful. He felt a flicker of gratitude for its presence, even though he couldn't understand why it had chosen to stay with him. Refreshed but still hungry, Davy tried to think of his next step. The bear had provided water, but food was another matter. He scanned the area, hoping to find berries or something edible. The bear, as if sensing his thoughts, began moving again, and Davy followed. They came across a bush laden with dark purple berries. Davy hesitated, unsure if they were safe to eat. The bear sniffed the berries, then pawed at the bush, pulling a small branch toward its mouth. It ate the fruit casually, as though demonstrating it was safe. Tentatively, Davy plucked a handful and tasted them. They were tart but satisfying. "Guess you're smarter than you look," Davy muttered, earning a glance from the bear that felt almost amused. The day passed in a rhythm of discovery and movement. Davy learned to watch the bear's behavior, using its instincts to guide him. They found more food, nuts, edible roots, and even a fish that the bear caught in the stream with surprising speed. Davy was both awed and repulsed as the bear tore into the fish. It left enough for him, though, and he cooked it awkwardly over a small fire. He managed to start with sticks and dry grass. As night fell, Davy felt the weight of exhaustion. The bear lay down nearby, curling into a massive ball of fur. Davy hesitated, then moved closer, drawn by its warmth. The bear didn't object, and Davy drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next day began peacefully, but by midday, Davy realized they weren't alone in the forest. The first sign was the scent of smoke. It was faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Davy's pulse quickened. A campfire meant people, and people meant rescue. He turned to the bear, which had also noticed the smell. Its ears were perked, its nose twitching. But instead of moving toward the scent, the bear let out a low growl and began walking in the opposite direction. "Wait," Davy called, confused. "We need to go that way." The bear ignored him, lumbering away. Frustrated but unwilling to part from his unlikely ally, Davy followed. The growling grew louder, and the bear's posture shifted. It seemed tense, on edge. Davi's confusion turned to unease. Something wasn't right. They reached a clearing, and Davi froze. Two men stood near the remnants of a campsite, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. A third figure lay crumpled on the ground between them, motionless. One of the men was holding a hunting rifle, its barrel glinting in the sunlight. Davi's breath caught. He ducked behind a tree, peering out cautiously. The bear stayed still, its massive body hidden in the undergrowth. The men were speaking, their voices low and harsh. "Should have just left him," one muttered, nudging the figure on the ground with his boot. "No one's gonna come looking." The other man grunted in agreement. "Let's move. We've got bigger problems than some kid." Davi's blood ran cold. A kid? Were they talking about him? Or was there someone else out here? Another victim of whatever these men were up to? He didn't have time to think. One of the men turned, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. Davi pressed himself against the bark, his heart pounding. The bear remained hidden but alert, its muscles taut like a coiled spring. The snap of a twig shattered the tense silence. One of the men raised his rifle, aiming toward the sound. Davi held his breath, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun them, and he had no weapon to defend himself. But the bear, could it help? As if on cue, the bear surged from the undergrowth, a massive force of nature. It roared, the sound echoing through the forest like thunder. The men shouted in alarm, stumbling back. The one with the rifle fired, the shot ringing out sharply, but the bullet missed its mark. The bear charged, its sheer size and power overwhelming. It knocked the rifle from the man's hands with a swipe of its paw, sending him sprawling. The second man fled, his footsteps fading rapidly. The bear stood over the remaining man, growling menacingly. The man whimpered, his bravado gone. Davi emerged from his hiding spot, his legs trembling. He approached cautiously, his eyes locked on the bear. It turned to him, its growl softening, and he felt a surge of gratitude and awe. "Let him go," Davi said quietly. The bear hesitated, then stepped back. The man scrambled to his feet and bolted, disappearing into the forest. Davi exhaled, his knees threatening to give out. The bear watched him, its dark eyes unreadable. "Thanks," Davi said, his voice shaky. He didn't know what kind of bond he had formed with this animal, but he knew one thing for certain. It had saved his life. "Let me know if you'd like to continue, and we'll delve deeper into the mystery of the men, Davi's past, and the connection between him and the bear. There's much more to unravel." Davi watched the forest settle back into silence, his heart still pounding from the encounter. The bear seemed unfazed, as if chasing off armed men was just another part of its existence. Davi, on the other hand, couldn't shake the image of the crumpled figure lying near the men's campsite. "We need to find out what's going on," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if the bear could even understand him. The animal blinked, then began walking again, its movements calm and deliberate. Davi hesitated but decided to follow. The bear had led him to safety before, and he had little choice but to trust it now. As they moved deeper into the forest, Davi's mind raced. Who were those men? What had they done? And what did they mean when they mentioned some kid? By late afternoon, they stumbled upon another campsite, this one abandoned. It was crude, with a threadbare tent and a few scattered belongings. An old map, a rusty knife, and a small notebook. Davi knelt, flipping through the notebook. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, a mix of ramblings and what looked like coordinates. One phrase stood out, written in bold letters: "Find the boy. He knows." Davi's chest tightened. What boy? Were they talking about him? The handwriting didn't provide answers, but the coordinates intrigued him. He tore the page out and stuffed it into his pocket. The bear sniffed the air, its ears twitching. Davi looked up, sensing its unease. A shadow moved through the trees, and Davi froze. The man with the rifle had returned, this time alone, but with a grim determination etched on his face. "Come out, kid," the man called, his voice low and menacing. "I know you're out here. You and that bear." Davi's heart sank. How had the man found him so quickly? He glanced at the bear, which had crouched low, its eyes locked on the intruder. It let out a low growl, but Davy placed a trembling hand on its shoulder. "No," he whispered. "We need to run." They moved silently through the trees, the bear leading the way. The man's voice grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and the campsite. Davy's relief was short-lived, though, as a gunshot rang out, the bullet thudding into a tree just inches from him. "Keep going," Davy urged, his voice breaking. The bear quickened its pace, its movements surprisingly quiet for its size. Davy scrambled after it, adrenaline propelling him forward. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and noise, but the bear navigated it effortlessly. Finally, they reached a narrow ravine, its steep walls lined with jagged rocks. The bear stopped, looking back at Davy. He understood immediately. They had to cross. Davy's breath caught as he peered over the edge. The drop was dizzying, but there was no other option. He gripped a nearby branch and swung himself onto the narrow ledge, inching along carefully. The bear followed, its paws finding steady footing on the precarious path. Halfway across, another gunshot shattered the air. The man had caught up, his rifle aimed directly at them. Davy pressed himself against the rock, panic surging through him. But before the man could fire again, the bear roared, a deafening sound that echoed through the ravine. The distraction worked. The man flinched, his footing slipping on the loose gravel. He stumbled, dropping the rifle, which clattered into the ravine below. He cursed, scrambling to regain his balance. Davy took the opportunity to climb faster, his fingers scraping against the rough stone. The bear followed, its massive body moving with surprising agility. When they finally reached the other side, Davy collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The man didn't follow. Davy watched as he turned back, retreating into the forest. For now, they were safe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Davy and the bear found shelter in a small cave. Exhausted, Davy leaned against the cool stone wall, clutching the torn page from the notebook. The phrase "find the boy he knows" played on a loop in his mind. What did he know? And why were these men after him? His thoughts drifted to his father, Jake. Could this be connected to him? Jake had always been secretive, especially in the years after Davy's mother died. There had been late-night phone calls, whispered conversations, and a growing paranoia that had driven Jake to drink. Davy had assumed it was grief, but now he wasn't so sure. He glanced at the bear, which was curled up nearby, its breathing steady. "Why are you helping me?" he asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear didn't respond, of course, but its presence felt like an answer in itself. Davy pulled out the page again, studying the coordinates. They were unfamiliar, but he had seen a compass in the abandoned campsite. If he could find it, he might be able to follow the trail and uncover the truth. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by dreams of his father, the men, and the bear. When morning came, Davy felt a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was done running blindly. By midday, Davy and the bear reached the edge of the forest, where a dirt road wound through the landscape. A rusted sign pointed to a nearby town, the first sign of civilization Davy had seen in days. But as they approached, a pickup truck rumbled into view, the same one that had left him on the side of the road. "Jake." Davy's pulse quickened as the truck screeched to a halt. His father climbed out, looking disheveled and desperate. "Davy," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You have to come with me. Now." Davy didn't move. He clenched his fists, anger and confusion swirling inside him. "Why?" he demanded. "Why did you leave me?" Jake's face twisted with guilt. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice trembling. "They were coming for you. I thought if I left you out here, they'd stop." "They? Who are they?" Davy shouted. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the bear. "Because of your mother," he said finally. She wasn't who you think she was." The words hit Davy like a punch to the gut. Before he could process them, the roar of an engine cut through the air. Another truck appeared, this one carrying the men from the forest. The rifle gleamed in the passenger seat. Jake's face paled. "Get in the truck," he yelled. The bear growled, stepping protectively in front of Davy. The pieces began to fall into place. His mother's mysterious past, Jake's paranoia, the men hunting him, they were all connected. But how? And why?